Hi everybody and welcome back to the asthmatic, arthritic, ancient Aylesbury alcohol-based 10 to 15 minute no frills, no waffle true crime bedtime story. Now, I still haven't worked out yet if you're supposed to be so relaxed you nod off or so excited by the drama that you can't sleep. Anyway, as long as you don't think, what on earth is this pile of steaming horse dung, and switch off, then I'll be dead chuffed. Anyway, tonight, episode 3, and they said it wouldn't last, is the Demon Barber of Blackburn. Now, all the waffle is at the end, so you can listen to that or switch it off after the story. And remember, I'm a complete computer dunce, so there's no editing it. It comes to you, one take, warts and all. So let's crack on. 7-year-old Emily Agnes Holland had a new friend, she told her schoolmates as she approached the shop. He had given her 3 halfpennies to get half an ounce of tobacco from Mr. Cox's ginger beer manufacturer and grocer's shop. They don't do names like that anymore. This she did, which straight away brings me to the first one of the things that bothered me about this case. Apparently, a young child could pick up tobacco from a shop for an adult with written consent in those days, but I couldn't find anything about a note given to the shopkeeper, and surely, if there was one, it would have been signed by the person who asked her to fetch the tobacco. But she did purchase the tobacco. The last person to see her was a 12-year-old girl called Mary Ellen Eccles at 4 p.m. on Tuesday the 28th of March 1876. She was never seen alive again. A search was made for Emily when she didn't arrive back home to her home at 110 Moss Street, but she couldn't be found. On the 30th of March, a Mrs. Alice White of Baswell Terrace was alerted to some dogs sniffing around a parcel on Baswell Field near the graveyard. She found blood-stained copies of the Preston Herald newspaper tied with string. She didn't like the look of it, so she got a local labourer to cut the string. Inside was the grisly sight of a young girl's torso minus arms, legs and head. Emily's torso was identified by her parents, James and Elizabeth, by a mark on her back. On March the 21st, Emily's legs were recovered. They were found in a drain in Rishton, about 4 miles from where Emily's torso was found. A man called Richard Fairclough had seen another man acting suspiciously, and when he left, he went to investigate. They also were wrapped in old copies of the Preston Herald. Dr. Maitland, the police surgeon, examined the body parts and came to the conclusion that Emily had been violently raped before being murdered by having her throat cut, and all the blood had been drained from her body. A very sharp knife had been used for the dismemberment. What Dr. Maitland also found, which was very interesting, was the newspapers and the body were covered in hair of different lengths, colours and textures, which had the doctor wondering if the murder could have been committed by a barber. Of course, Chief Constable Potts had decided the murderer was a tramp, and he decided to go down that path. Robert Taylor, a man of that description, was arrested 2 weeks later in Derbyshire, but none of the witnesses who saw the man talking to Emily picked him out of the ID parade. Now, even though Potts still believed in the tramp theory, he begrudgingly allowed the barber shops in the area to be searched. Now, they got this down to 2. One was owned by a Dennis Whitehead and the other was a barber shop at 3 Moss Street, owned by William Henry Halliwell Fish, who suspicion fell on when a pile of copies of the Preston Herald were found in a corner of the shop, which had the copies correspondingly exactly with those found wrapped around the body parts missing. But that was all. There was nothing else. So even though questioned, he was released without charge. But mud sticks, and now he was under strong suspicion by the locals. Consequently, his business boomed as people wanted to see the would-be murderer. Now, he was said to sing as he worked, things like, "Tomorrow will be Friday and we've caught no fish today." Now, Friday being Fish and Chip Day in the UK, so it made it quite clever, especially with his name being Fish as well, but not if you're the murderer. If you are, then it's probably best to keep your mouth shut. In the end, with gangs of youths outside singing "Barber, Barber, who killed the girl?" and "Emily, Emily, who killed little Emily?" I don't somehow think they'll be hits. And women just standing in the shop and glaring at him like he was stood in a supermarket without a mask in a pandemic, he had to ask for police protection. By the time of the second inquest, Robert Taylor had been released, and the police were getting severe criticism for not finding the murderer. It was at this time that Peter Nelson, a local painter who owned a half-bred bloodhound and a Clumber Spaniel, saw reports of the murder and offered the use of his dogs to the chief constable. Potts was in his desperation, so he accepted. This was the first recorded case where dogs had been used. Now, Potts did get a lot of criticism for using the dogs, but I actually think it was pretty inspired. They first went to the site of the discovery of Emily's body parts, but the dogs picked up nothing. They then went to Dennis Whitehead's and still nothing, so they moved on next to William Fish's shop, where Morgan, the bloodhound, started sniffing at the door to the stairs to the upper floor of the shop. As soon as the door was opened, the dogs both flew upstairs. Now, Morgan first sniffed at some clothes in a back room, then suddenly turned and ran into the front room, barking like crazy at the fireplace and sticking his head up the chimney. They pulled the dog away and looked up the chimney, and inside, on a shelf, was found Emily's burnt skull and arms wrapped in the remainder of her clothes. The 5'2" each slight man with sunken eyes and prominent forehead, who was stood watching all this quietly with his wife, was taken into custody. A crowd had gathered quickly, and the police had to fight to get Fish away from the mob who was set on lynching him. At first, Fish tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming, and Fish made a full confession that on the day of the murder he indeed sent Emily to buy the tobacco. Then when she returned, he took her upstairs, gagged and raped her, then cut her throat twice, using her own clothes to prevent her blood flowing onto the floor. He then went downstairs and shaved 2 customers with the same razor that he had just used to kill Emily. He then dismembered the body and wrapped up the portions in the newspaper. He put the head and arms in the downstairs fireplace and got a good fire going, then locked up and went to the theatre for the evening. Local witnesses testified to see a fire blazing in the empty building. Later on, he hid them in the upstairs chimney. Now, just to show I don't just copy all this down from Wikipedia, another thing that bugged me was, where was his wife and children while all this went on. I couldn't find anywhere any mention of another address. So did they all live above the barber shop? And at last I found it in the Llangollen Advertiser, a Welsh paper. The family lived at 162 Moss Street and not above the shop. So that was that little mystery over. Fish's trial was held at Liverpool Assizes in July. His full confession meant that he would be found guilty of murder, but he pleaded insanity. He had in fact had a bad fall from an aqueduct when he was a boy, sustaining serious head injuries. This defence, though, was unsuccessful, and the judge sentenced him to death. In response to this, Fish said to the jury, "I am sure, gentlemen, I did not know at the time what I was doing." He had a tearful last meeting days before the execution with his family, his wife telling him to give up all thoughts of this world and prepare himself for the doom which awaited him, which of course cheered him up no end. He was hanged at Kirkdale Jail, Liverpool, at 8 a.m. on August the 14th, 1876. He was only 26 years old. Well, I hope you're still awake and you enjoyed the story tonight. To everyone who is switching off now, good night, stay safe, sleep well, and see you soon, hopefully. And to the rest of you gluttons for punishment, here's the waffle. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ped10 for giving me a 5-star rating and a lovely review. She says, "I love listening to this podcast. No waffle, get straight to the point, good humour and easy to listen to." Well, thank you very much for that, Ped10, and for taking the time to write that. I really do appreciate it. Also, tonight, I'm going to put out a massive shout to Justin at the Mysterious Circumstances podcast. I absolutely love everything about this podcast. The research, the stories, the delivery, Justin's voice and laid-back delivery is just excellent. If you love hauntings, murders, celebrity strange lives and deaths and Wild West legends, this is for you. So please check out Mysterious Circumstances everywhere. Also, a quick shout out to Rob, Jason and Dave, who will be listening to this on their tea break at Omnicote. Come downstairs later, lads, and tell me what you thought. Sleep well, everybody, and remember, not everyone is as mad as a box of frogs. Good night.